Hey church, Pastor Shane here with another community group discussion starter video. We're back in the book of Genesis for our sermon series on the Joseph narrative that called God Meant It for Good. Back in there and go to kind of a really interesting story in Joseph's life, which led to really a sermon about temptation. When we get back in the story, we find that Joseph is doing really well in slavery, as well as one could be if one is enslaved. And he's risen to the head of the household, so much so that the owner of the household has given everything into Joseph's control. He doesn't worry about anything. Joseph manages everything, which is about as good as you can get it. But he's tempted by the owner's wife, by Potiphar's wife, to be with her. He's sexually harassed by her and tempted to give in. We talked about the fact that he really faces two temptations that we could kind of relate to today. The first temptation is the temptation of just trying to improperly fill one of our desires, right? When we're just desiring something, whether it is that sin of lust or it's something that leads to selfishness or whatever it might be, in the moment we just feel like we want or need something, and that could lead us away from God's and towards our sin. Or the second temptation he was faced is that there was going to be consequences if he kept saying no to her. He was a slave. He had to do what he was told. And we find out in the story that she ends up lying to the master, saying that Joseph actually sexually assaulted her. Joseph ends up getting thrown in prison. And that's a temptation we face because sometimes doing the right thing brings consequences. Sometimes when we do the right thing, it could be difficult for us. There might be some difficulty with that. But that's part of facing the different temptations that we face. We talked about how important it is to do what Joseph did in this story, which was to identify that ultimately the sin was not just bad for him, or that going to the sin would have been an offense to the owner of the household by sleeping with his wife, but also that it's an affront to God. Sin is a rebellion and a pushback against God. And when we realize that, we have a God of grace and mercy and kindness, we realize that God is not tempting us, as it says in James chapter 1. James chapter 1 says God does not tempt us. And then in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, it talks about the fact that God will always make a way of escape for us, that he'll never tempt us with more than we could imagine. More than we could manage. Now, sometimes God gives us more than we could manage in life. We need his help to get through. But when it comes to temptation, he's not going to give us a temptation so strong that we can't handle it. He's always going to provide a way out for us. That God is for us. He's behind us. He is drawing us to himself. And when we realize that sin is really this rebellion against God, we could run to God. And it helps us make the right choice about our temptation. And it leads us away from our sin. 1 Corinthians is actually kind of interesting. Chapter 10. I just read let me read the brief part of that again because it's important. But I want to tell you about the context as well. It's said in chapter 10 and verse 13 that no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. Here's the really interesting thing about the context of that. The context of that passage is not just random sin, although it does mention some kind of random sins here in the passage. It is addressing idolatry. It starts and ends with idolatry. That sin is ultimately idolatry, that we're putting something else before God, that we're turning away against God in rebellion and towards something else. And the context, I think, makes the point even stronger that God does not desire for us to turn to idols. He does not desire for us to go into sin. He sent Christ to pay for our sins, and now he desires to help us walk in newness of life. And he is doing that. And the final point we talked about from the story is that even though Joseph is sold into slavery here, God ends up still doing amazing things through him. And through his being in this prison, and even rising to the rank of end up running the prison as one of the prisoners, God uses that event to propel him to eventually be prime minister of Egypt and save countless lives during a famine, and even save his own family's life eventually as well. The point is that God's ways are always better, and we want to cling to God's ways. Right? His ways are always going to be better than the way of that temptation might lead us. And so it's just an encouragement to us as we face temptation, we prepare to face temptation, that God's ways are always going to be better. And so it's always better to choose what we know is right, rather than to fall into the trap of temptation that would lead us against God. And we can triumph over temptation like Joseph did, when we recognize that sin is a rebellion against God and that he desires for us to follow him, and we see that his ways are always better. I hope you have a great discussion.